Our keynote speaker for this morning is Professor Janice Sipior. Professor Janice Sipior is Professor of Management, Information Systems in the Department of Accounting and Information Systems at Villanova University, Pennsylvania, United States of America. Her academic experience also includes visiting positions at the University of Warsaw, Poland, and Moscow State Linguistic University, Russia, and faculty positions at the University of North Carolina, at the Greensboro, United States of America, and Canisius College, USA. She earned her PhD at the State University of New York, at Buffalo University, United States of America. She was previously employed in computer planning at HSBC, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank Corporation. Her research interests include ethical and legal aspects of information technology, privacy system developing strategies, and knowledge management. Yeah? She has over 100 refereed publications in journals, conference proceedings, and books. Janice has significant international experience, having taught at the University of Warsaw, Poland, and Moscow State Linguistic University, Russia. She consulted to the Suleiman Alliance School of Business at the American University of Beirut, Lebanon. She has presented at various conferences, amongst others, Finland, France, Germany. Janice currently serves as editor-in-chief of Information Systems Management and is associate editor of Information Resource Management Journal. And to that end, I thought Janice can join me here at the front and talk to us. Thank you.
Good morning. Again, I'm Janice Sipior from Villanova School of Business, and I must say I am so honored to be here. I would like to thank Dr. Wafi, my good friend, for inviting me. I would also like to thank Dr. Abdullah, Dr. Mansour, and Dr. Alam for your gracious welcome. Sincerely, thank you. Okay, so as I get underway today, I'd like to give you a little bit more of my background as I share my perspective on publishing academic papers. And so, as mentioned, I served as the editor for 12 years of the Information Systems Management Journal. So this journal is published by Taylor and Francis, and it is a long-standing journal in my field dating back to 1984. So the focus is on managing information systems, and it's unique in that it targets both an academic audience as well as a practitioner audience. And as was mentioned, with this journal, I have 2 forthcoming special issues. So the next one is focusing on business intelligence and big data. This one will be scheduled for the 2nd issue of this year, volume 37. And the 2nd special issue is underway. The call for papers is forthcoming on data mining and data analytics. So I also serve as associate editor for Information Resources Management Journal. And this one also is long-standing, dating back to 1988, published by IGI Global. Okay, so what I'd like to share with you is a journey in terms of publishing. So the most important step is to identify your research project. And of course, you continue through to the point where you realize the journey is ongoing. And so you want to develop a portfolio of research. So topic identification is the first step. And as we saw yesterday, there's some topics that maybe have run their course. So we saw the technology acceptance model is certainly over-researched, and so you don't want to get a topic that is in this state. You want a topic that has an interest to it. So with this, you want to consider impact. And many times you're not thinking about this because, of course, you want something that's your interest. But you want to have an individual research impact as a researcher. So the best way to do this, really, is to focus on a topic in the mainstream as opposed to a niche. And of course, there's more individuals in the mainstream, so your chances of being cited, just by sheer number, are higher. So to do this, you want to read the current articles in your top journals and get a feel for what's out there. And when you first choose your topic, you're thinking, I'm going to make this seminal contribution. But that's not really the purpose. What you want to do is just to simply extend the existing body of literature. So you would maybe extend the theory, and with this, you have to think about what's unique, what your contribution is going to be. So we saw yesterday that everyone is certainly on the same page in terms of recognizing the necessity to identify a gap in the research. And so with this, the best place is to examine current articles and focus on the directions for future research. So the other researchers in your area have identified different paths that you could take. So you might extend the research model by adding another variable, replacing a variable, extending the sample, for example. You might focus on one particular industry that hasn't been researched previously. Change the research method. Perhaps it was experimental and you're going to undertake a survey. You want to trailblaze in some sense. Something that's novel, something that's unique, something that's a contribution. Of course, you have to think about the type of paper as well. So theoretical papers might combine existing theories. You might add additional variables of consideration within that theory. And then empirical, of course, is testing theory. The practical papers, you're trying to provide some insight for those who are working within the field. But among these, of course, the theoretical and the practical are the most difficult to get published. So you want to make that recognition in terms of the focus. And it has to match the journal. It has to be a fit for the journal. So journals have different orientations. So you saw with information systems management, for example, the orientation was much more toward academic, but a recognition of the practical implications. And so if you're doing a theoretical paper, you don't want to target the wrong journal, the wrong outlet. So another consideration is to think about co-authorship. And with this, you want to add value with additional co-authors. Are they contributing something to what it is that you're doing? And how do you get those co-authors? You want someone who's experienced because you have a greater chance of publishing because they know the ropes. They know the avenue that you have to proceed down. So hopefully you can learn from an individual that you choose or cultivate. So how do you get that co-author? Well, the venue is obviously conferences, right? You want to be able to network. And so networking is what enables you to develop a relationship. It's like any other relationship, it has to be developed. You can't expect that you meet someone at a conference and you're immediately going to become co-authors. You have to develop with that individual. So it does take time. And so if you're thinking with a conference, well, your paper was rejected, there's other avenues of participation. So for example, you could think about a panel session and you're inviting others to join you. And that would be also an invitation to get to know the individual so they recognize there's an interest between the two of you. There's other sessions that would focus on a topic of your research, for example. And if there's a session with like researchers, you want to attend that because it's the individuals who are also interested in your specific topic. So the most important step, of course, is producing the paper. So you need to put blinders on, you need to focus, and most importantly, write. So you don't want to think about your topic too much. You want to get your words down on paper and start developing. And so in this process, it's the current literature that becomes very critical. You need to be very familiar with it. And so your frame of reference then places you into that focus. And so, of course, in presenting your work at a conference, even if it's not fully developed, is where you get feedback. So research in progress sessions are specifically designed to enable you to get that feedback. That's so ever important. We saw that yesterday. So you already have the Doctoral Symposium that has given you the experience, and you want to extend that into conference sessions. So important within writing is to clearly communicate the content. So someone should readily be able to read your paper and understand what it is that you're addressing. Certainly check everything, double check, have someone else read your paper over, try to get a copy editor even. Well, in this process, of course, rejection is inevitable. We've all been there. I don't know of anyone who has not had a paper rejected. And believe it or not, you need to embrace rejection. It's a difficult thing to do because you have critical feedback. But if you take it as a learning experience, you're going to benefit. So you need to step back. Don't take it to heart and recognize that what critique has been done with your work enables you to improve it. And so with a paper, you want to continue that improvement. And you put so much work in that each paper should be submitted at least 3 times, maybe even more. After 3, you really need to change the focus. Take a rewrite of the paper if that's necessary. So this seems rather simplistic in terms of what areas should be included within a paper. You would be amazed at the submissions that I receive that don't touch upon these areas. And that's going to result in a rejection. And so seemingly you think, yes, of course I have all this included within my paper. But you almost have to take this as a checklist. Now each of these does not have to be a section. So you don't need to have headings for each of these, but you do have to have content. The abstract is the most important. So as an editor, when I receive a submission, the first I read is the abstract. It should give me a sense of the contribution. The area, just briefly explain the area, but the contribution is so very important. You want to state that up front. So the introduction, I scan through and look for why is this research being undertaken? What is the motivation? So that becomes a very critical element. And then I really just scan the literature review when I take a look at the initial submission to see is the citation are the citations current? Is this a new area, or is it a paper that's been reworked? If you're reworking a paper, make sure you put current references in there to bring it up to date. The research questions would be laid out, and I focus on methodology next, really, to see what is it that's been done? How was the sample obtained, for example? And then, okay, there's the analysis, discussion, what are the results? And most important is contribution. So you want to discuss your results within the body of literature. How are you moving that literature forward? Mention the research limitations. Directions for future research are an indicator of the sustainability of your topic. Is it a topic that is a dead end? Or are there many directions for future research? So this becomes important, the directions. Conclusions should succinctly restate what's contained within the entire paper. So when you look at the abstract, the introduction, contributions, and conclusions, those are the important elements. Be very certain that these sections are strong. If they're not strong, it's going to result in a desk rejection. Your paper is not even going to get a chance to be reviewed. So in terms of the composition of the paper, you really want to sit down and within a month write it. And the reason for that, and you probably find it's true, that when you step back, you lose your train of thought. But sometimes you have to step back, you have other responsibilities. In that instance, leave yourself notes. Provide a trail of breadcrumbs. Indicate what you were going to do next. So when you pick it up again, you don't have a huge startup cost. You don't have to get yourself back into it. You can see where you left off. So be sure to provide yourself with that understanding of what you need to do next. And so as I mentioned, the introduction is so ever critical. And so spend time writing it. It should be maybe about 2 pages. And why are you addressing a specific research area? And as it turns out, it is very true. Most reviewers will make up their mind within about 15 minutes, and you say, wait, they didn't read my entire paper, and that could be the case. But you haven't framed it, you haven't set the stage, you haven't enticed them to continue reading your paper. So it becomes very important to state everything in terms of motivation and the direction you're heading for the paper in the introduction. So the main body is what you would write first. So you want a rough outline because you're really not certain exactly where you're headed, but you have a rough idea. And of course, you begin with the main component. You can't start writing the introduction first. You don't know what you're introducing until you've written the body. So you don't want to read too much, but you do want to grab some papers that represent what it is that you're doing. And you can use those papers as a guide. Many times in my own research, I'll do that. I'll find a paper and I map my paper to a similar existing article. And of course, in terms of citing work, if you're building on your work, that's great. But you have to have other citations that demonstrate you're not the only person looking at this particular area. You want to demonstrate that it is a viable topic. And so you have to have important key references. You need those big names who are researching your topic to show that you understand what's being done within the area. So that becomes very critical. And of course, indicate why those references are important, how they relate to your specific angle on the research you're undertaking. So stylistics. Many times we don't think about English stylistics, but it becomes important. You don't want a paragraph that runs on. You want subheadings. You want to divide the paper into the sections. You don't want the reader to have to work. Everything should be clearly presented. By glancing at the paper, you should have a feel for the content of that paper without having to read the depth. So you would be surprised. I do get papers that have very few subheadings, and it makes me work. If I have to work, then I feel it's not ready. It should not yet have been submitted. It needs to be presented much more clearly. So think about the use of the visuals, the figures, the tables, because someone can very readily understand your research through these. You're making it easier for the reviewer if everything is laid out in a comprehensive manner. Of course, you don't want to have too much content. So maybe about 8,000 words. So the longer papers have a greater chance of rejection. So you do need to be concise and comprehensive, but don't go on for too long. And of course, discussing results. Discussing results, you want to indicate how the results go back to your hypotheses. Explain how you're moving the area forward. So the reviewer gains an understanding of how you're leading them through and what you're trying to attain. So what's very critical in this is literature. You want to cite the literature that backs up the findings that you have. So you cannot do the discussion in isolation. Many times I get submissions that don't have any citations within the discussion. So if you're indicating you're moving the body of literature forward, you have no citations, it doesn't make any sense. You have to convince the reviewer of what it is that you're doing to progress the particular topic. So focus on the findings and discuss them in terms of not just the implications for research. I think we are all researchers and that is our focus. And so I get papers that forget why we're doing the research, and that is to inform the practitioners, those who are actually working in the area. So the research is really for their benefit. It's not done in isolation for each other in this room. So as I mentioned, citing previous research, which is in support of your findings, is very important. And of course, explaining the results. So if you have something that's surprising, you want to explain why you believe those results were attained. You're the one who knows that research the best. You understand why it was surprising. So if it's surprising, you want to share that with the reader. You want that reader to equally be surprised, but then to understand why those results were found. So explain those results by using that greater depth, your insight. So this is really the true contribution. Because you know your work, you know why you got the findings that you got because you've been working in that area for some time. And so the implications for practitioners is very important. But you might also have implications for policy. This isn't always the case, but certainly for researchers and for practitioners. If there is policy implications, then you do want to extend because it provides an even greater contribution of your work. And of course, in terms of theory, we want to bring the theory into the real world because we're doing the research so that we can improve the practitioner's set of responsibilities. So we want to bring in the real world, identify specific steps that could be taken. So in terms of practice, what does it really mean, your findings based on theory? So how can we apply those findings to everyday workers? So the limitations. Many times we think, well, the limitations weaken the work, but that's not really true. It's not true, of course. You want to acknowledge those limitations certainly before the reviewers find them. And so the limitations could simply be that you've only addressed one industry. You certainly can't address everything within one paper. Maybe your sample looks at one particular culture, and perhaps then future research could be extended for a cross-cultural comparison, for example. So you want to somehow identify how your findings could be generalized. So the limitations perhaps do not allow generalizability, but you could indicate that additional samples focus on additional industries could therefore generalize what you've done. And also a discussion of how you extend the theory. So you may have added additional variables, you may have simply tested a theory on a new population, for example, and then formulate directions for future research. As I mentioned, this is an indicator of the viability of your area. And so if your paper is to make a contribution, it has to be an area that's of interest and has future work to be done. And of course, the conclusion. The conclusion is a very important component. As I mentioned, I look at the abstract, I look at the introduction, and then I look at the conclusion. The conclusion should be a clear statement of what it is that you have done. So what you set out to find, what motivated the research, and then in terms of the findings, the importance of them. So what implications did they have? But it has to be a summary. You don't want to rehash, but you want to highlight. And so someone clearly gets a sense. And so when I write the letter from the editor, for example, I provide a synopsis of each of the papers that are presented in an issue. And so to do that, I go back to the abstract, the introduction, and the conclusion. Those are very important components of your paper. And they seem that they're the most simplistic because you feel that the body of the paper, the methodology and so forth is critical, but rather to communicate what you've done to reviewers, it is the abstract, introduction, and conclusion in particular that are the most important components. So, to prepare your paper for submission, you want to look at articles that are in the journal that you're targeting. So each journal is different. So you really have to read the aims and scope. So for my journal, I'm sometimes amazed at the submissions I receive. They're very quantitative in some instances. My journal is not a quantitative algorithmic journal. It's the management of information systems. And so immediately the paper is a desk reject on the basis of fit. And I'm amazed. I don't understand why an author doesn't take a look at the journal's website and read the aims and scope. It seems clearly stated. It's a straightforward statement of the necessity to focus not only on research but practitioners as well. And again, many times I get submissions that say nothing to practitioners. So it's so critical that if you're targeting a journal, you know that it's a fit. So you make that assessment, and if you've made it, equally I will likely agree. So also the author guidelines give some indication of the fit. So you want to, in preparing to target a specific journal, you want to further improve your paper. You think it's ready, but when you've selected the journal, there's certain considerations that you need to keep in mind along with the fit. So you want to make sure that your statement of your contribution is clearly stated. That becomes so important for not getting test rejected. Make sure that as you read through, someone understands where you're taking the reader through the paper. So it should be clear that you're moving them through. So you have somewhat of a thread as you continue. And then, of course, indicate how your work fits in with that current body of literature. Good advice is to find someone who will review your paper. So you might want to do that yourself, act as a reviewer, but I find that difficult. Sometimes when I think of looking at other work, I'm much better at the constructive critique of others than I am of myself. I think when you write, you're too involved with it. You can't step back. You can try to step back, so it's much better to enlist a colleague, someone who would review it before it's submitted. And it improves your chances of getting the paper under review. So you don't want to be desk rejected. You want to at least get to the reviewer stage, because that's going to increase your chances of getting accepted as well. So if you get under review, you've made it through the first step in the publication process. But, of course, the inevitable rejection may occur. So when you get the letter of rejection, formulate a plan. Step back, remove the emotional response, and devise a logical plan. What are you going to do? You want to address the issues raised. So many researchers look at the rejection letter and think, no, my paper is great. I'll just simply turn it around, submit to another journal. I know there's those of us who have done that. You're doomed for failure. It's going to happen a second time. You don't believe it will. You just think, oh, no, these reviewers did not understand what I was trying to communicate. It was them, not me. Don't take that stance. You really need to seriously consider the comments that were made. Take a look at your paper, go back, recognize why a comment was made. Try to make some type of improvement, change it in some sense. So you have to make that significant effort. I cannot underscore that enough, because I know we've probably all been guilty of just thinking, okay, we'll just submit it elsewhere, it's fine. So you don't want to let the paper sit for too long. You don't want it to become dated. And you want to make that contribution perhaps before someone else does. So make sure that you plan for a short time frame to turn the paper around and resubmit. So in revising your paper, as I mentioned, your focus should be, your goal should be improving the likelihood, the probability of getting that paper at least under review. And so you have to take it seriously. You can't just think, okay, I'll just do a little change here or there. In some instances, you really should evaluate, perhaps I should undertake an entire restructuring. I'm in that process currently, admittedly. I have a paper with a colleague who is in accounting. I don't know the accounting journals quite as well, so I'm relying on my co-author for that. But at this point, we're entirely restructuring the paper. It's, yeah. But you do have to think about that. Don't just simply do a quick revision and resubmit. So in this process, you might want to share some of the reviewer's comments with others to get their interpretation. What is it that reviewer really is saying? You may not understand what they're saying because you're so involved with that paper. You need to step back, and a colleague is the best person who has that objective understanding. And when you revise, the difficult thing is that you are many times including new content. Okay, so maybe I need another visual, I need a table, or I need a figure. You have to make sure that you've renumbered the tables if you excluded something. So go back, and you don't want to introduce new errors in the revision. So be very careful in that process. So again, you're trying to improve the paper, improve your chances of acceptance. So it's very critical that you do carefully go through that revision. So if you're fortunate to get your paper under review and you receive that revise and resubmit, your response to that set of comments should first be a cover letter to the editor stating just in a simple way what it is that you've done to improve the paper. You don't need depth, you just want to say perhaps you have to collect an additional sample. So just simply state that. And then the editor has an understanding of what it is that you've redone. For the reviewers, however, the reviewers want to know specifically, did you attend to their individual concerns? The best way to demonstrate that you have and to communicate that to the reviewer is to formulate a table. So the first column should be every comment. And the second column should be the response to each of those comments. So interestingly, if you do not have every issue raised, the reviewer feels that your paper has not been revised sufficiently. They feel that you haven't really addressed what their concerns were. So you don't want their negative approach to your paper. So as a result, do identify each individual issue that's raised and list it. And interestingly, I have had authors who feel they have a conversation with the reviewer. You're not conversing with the reviewer. Your response should not be within your letter to the reviewer of how you revise the paper. Your response should be in the paper. It seems like it's common sense, but I've had authors who are just responding individually to the reviewer. If the reviewer had that concern, then others are going to have that same concern. So make sure you state that you have changed a specific sentence, a specific paragraph, whatever it is. You want the reviewer to be able to go directly to that change, see what's been made. So usually it's a requirement that you have track changes to allow someone to readily find what's been changed. It's usually a requirement. If it's not a requirement, make sure you do have track changes. And so again, you're not just composing the response for the reviewer. I think that researchers get so into their paper, they don't recognize that you're not just conversing with the reviewer. It has to be a change in the paper. So the reviewers want to know that you've taken their comments to heart. So you want to thank them. You want to have a positive interaction with the reviewer. You want to get acceptance. So you don't want that animosity at all. You don't want to argue with the reviewer. You want to thank them. You want them to know that you're truly considering their comment. So some of the examples then, I think this might be helpful in terms of responding. So if you get negative feedback, you want to rephrase it to the positive in some manner. So for example, a reviewer might say, well, this paper doesn't make a theoretical contribution. And you might be thinking, of course I am, but it's not evident. The reviewer did not feel that. The first thing you do in the response, thank you. Okay, so, but you want to have a different phrase each time. You can't just keep saying thank you for each response. So I myself always find this difficult. How do I thank the reviewer for the specific comment? So I almost get a thesaurus out and say, okay, this one's an observation. This one, so thank you for your observation. And you're turning it again to the positive. We made the theoretical contribution explicit by or with, or so you would explain. And then, of course, within the paper itself, you indicate where they should go. It's on page 5 in paragraph 3, and we sometimes, yes, highlight it, and sometimes you can even put in quotes, this is what we said. So the reviewer sees it in front of them, maybe not even have to go back to the paper. So if it's a simple change, you can place it within the table. If it's a very in-depth change, then of course you want to tell them you have to read it in the paper. So also you want, as I mentioned, to internalize the critique, which is difficult to do. Remove the emotion, internalize it so that you're able to respond logically. So if you get a reviewer who says, so they're focusing on the terminology that you're using and inconsistency. So rather than professional identity, used in the title, the author explores professional discourse. So that's the term that you're using in indicating the findings. So there's a discrepancy. The reviewer does not understand specifically what your variables are. So in response, you want to say, this is very useful. I found this useful that I didn't realize I used different terminology. So try to acknowledge and then turn it to a positive. Yes, in fact, we're framing professionalism. That is what we're doing. And so we've changed the wording. So try to give that indication. So I think getting some examples of a recognition of how you would proceed through. Many times authors don't have a clear table. They present in paragraph form how they've revised in accordance with the reviewer comments. It's difficult to follow. If you have the table with each column, with each comment in the first column, and then the response in the second column, it's clear. The reviewer can go to one specific concern and recognize, it has been addressed, and they find their experience positive because they receive the thank you. They feel that their time spent on your work was appreciated. So, in terms of acceptance, interestingly, less than the majority get positive comments. So you're not the only one who's receiving these critiques. So some of the high-level journals, now my journal has an acceptance rate about 12 to 15%. Sometimes I feel I desk reject such a high volume. Don't be one of those that's desk rejected. At least get into the third that gets under review. So some of the top journals have such a low acceptance rate, as low as 3%. But as you go through this process, you'll find some reviewers are much more thorough than other reviewers. And you recognize that maybe it's a little bit subjective, but it's not a game of luck. It's a game of hard work. So make sure that you have put that painstaking work in to come to the success of receiving an acceptance. So of course, the objective of revising your paper is to make it a positive experience, not just for you, but for the reviewers, and that positive energy will result in that acceptance. So, lastly, once you attain that acceptance, the game is not over. The game continues. So you need to think about a plan for your research portfolio. You need to know what direction you're taking. And so with this, you might see as many as a 2-year process to get a paper accepted. And so as you go through this process, you're wondering why it takes so long. One reason why it takes so long is the response from the reviewers. So important in this process is for you to serve as a reviewer. So of course I'm encouraging everyone in this room, because I find that one of the most difficult elements of being an editor is to try to get agreement from individuals to serve as reviewers. So for you, in terms of starting out, it's a great experience. You're critiquing other work, you're understanding what is being researched in various areas, various topic areas. So it's a learning experience in terms of doing a review. What I've recognized in recent years, and I find it disappointing, but I do need to share to you as future researchers, future reviewers, is I'm experiencing an incidence of reviewers who agree to review and they don't follow through. So reminders are sent, and as I mentioned, you're wondering, why don't I receive any feedback? Why is this taking so long? And then you email me, the editor, and you ask, what's the status? Well, I'm looking at the status, I'm thinking, okay, I have one review returned, one reviewer who agreed, okay, they're overdue, I send another reminder. And the unfortunate thing, and this is the increased incidence, the reviewer never says, no, I don't have the time any longer. I committed and I cannot any longer hold the commitment. They just say nothing. So then I wonder, how long do I wait before, okay, I'm relying on this agreement, but there's nothing returned. So it adds a lot of time to the process. So if you have that insight, I think it's helpful, because you're wondering, what's happened to my paper? We're all volunteers, I understand that. If you make a commitment, you try to follow through, or simply indicate to me or any other editor that you can't keep that commitment. So that's part of why this process takes so long. We're all volunteers, we're all busy, and so it does add additional time to get reviews back. And that's where we see that 6 to 8 months. Why does it take so long? If they just sit down and read it, it's only an hour, maybe 2 hours to review. I'm not certain why it takes so long. We're all, like, as I mentioned, volunteers in the process, and so it's one of the last things on your list when you look at what needs to be completed every day. So we're highly dependent on timeliness. So, given that you know it's going to take quite a duration to get an acceptance, to get that final article out in print, you need to think about a timeline. So make a plan. Make a concerted plan in terms of your portfolio. You need to have papers that are different stages. So try to get some that are just beginning, some that are in the review process, some are at the revision stage. You want to have a pipeline so that the continuity is present. You don't want to diversify too much in terms of your portfolio, but you do see, at least within my field, and many others are impacted by technology, ever emergent new areas. So you do find some of those intriguing, you do want to maybe pursue them, but don't make your portfolio too broad in terms of the topic areas. So maybe a couple areas of specialization. And then of course, submit to different journals to improve your chances of acceptance. Certainly you would love that the top level, high quality journal publication, but you also want those that will be accepted eventually. So have a portfolio of the levels of publications. Okay, so we've come to the end. And